Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. In 1979, when the dynasty of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown and replaced by the Islamist rule of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, one of the most brutal and repressive regimes known to man rose to power. According to the great American patriot, Gabe Naranjo, who many of you heard on an AMET webinar last week, while negotiating behind closed doors in Vienna, the United States has promised to lift sanctions on some of the regime's worst terrorists and human rights violators, including, but not limited to, Mohsen Raisi and Ali Akbar Velayati, who were responsible for the 1994 AMIA bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 and wounded hundreds upon hundreds more. And Hassan Dagan, who led the IRGC forces into Lebanon when Hezbollah bombed the US Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, killing 241 US Marines as they were asleep in their beds. And of course, their beloved president, Ebrahim Raisi, who participated in the execution of approximately 5,000 courageous Iranian dissidents, including children, in the 1988, quote, death commissions, and trials that lasted typically only a few minutes before the death sentences were rendered. There were so many of Mr. Raisi's victims that they were loaded up by forklifts in groups of 6 onto cranes and hanged every 30 minutes. And now the regime is asking, and our American negotiators are actually considering, that the entire IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, be taken off the foreign terrorist organization list. Spokespeople for the administration are now circulating the pernicious and patently false rumor that FTO designation is merely symbolic. This is simply a way of sugarcoating an extremely bitter pill for the American people to swallow. After all, there are many Americans who came back from the war in Iraq without limbs, or even worse, some body bags, because of IEDs with Farsi imprints on them. Most Americans are good people and know the difference between good and evil. And we are considering enriching this regime, which is tied economically to Russia and to China, with $90 billion in unfrozen assets. None of this will go to the good people on the streets, 2/3 of which were born after the Khomeini Revolution, and many of whom deeply resent the regime. It will go to their nuclear development program, to their missile and drone development program, and to their huge network of terrorist proxies around the globe. It is quite perplexing for me to understand that as we are trying to isolate one evil, Russia, we are about to empower another one, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Here to tell us more about what life in Iran has been like for those who have been forced to remain there since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 is our incredibly qualified and wise guest. Cameron Khansarinia is the policy director of the National Union for Democracy in Iran, NUFDI, a Washington-based nonpartisan, nonprofit organization representing the Iranian American community in pursuit of a U.S. policy towards Iran rooted in democracy and in human rights. Prior to joining NUFDI, he lived in New York City and worked at BlackRock. He studied government and political theory at Harvard, where he served as the president of the Iranian Association and as the vice president of the student body. After the completion of his thesis under the advisement of Professor Harvey C. Manfeld, he graduated from Harvard in 2018. And it is indeed an honor and a privilege for us to have Cameron there and for me to call him a friend. Cameron, tell us a little bit of what life has been like for the good people of Iran since 1979.
Sure, Sarah. And first of all, thank you for the most kind introduction when you said that there was someone well qualified and wise. I thought that there must be some other speaker coming on today, but it's really a pleasure to be with you and Matt and your colleagues, Naomi and Hussein. and your board chair, David Green, as well. Thank you for all the work that you all do. It's really quite important, and it's my pleasure to be a part of today's event. It is my pleasure also to follow who you described as a great American patriot, a description with which I most agree, and a good friend and colleague of mine, Gabriel Naranjo, who has been doing so much good work in the past few weeks, in addition to the good work he's done in the past few years. So I'll briefly answer your question, Sarah, and discuss what life is like for the people of Iran today. Before I go into my remarks, which I will attempt to keep brief, and then I look forward to answering your questions and the questions of any folks who are kind of to join us for today's event. In short, life for the people of Iran, not only today, but for the past 43 years, has been quite awful. In my prepared remarks, I'll give you some more reasons as to why and sort of the basis for that, and how we got to today in terms of U.S. policy towards the Islamic Republic. But in short, today's regime in Iran, the Islamic Republic, and the society that it has created for so many groups, unfortunately, is an apartheid state. It is a gender apartheid state. It is an apartheid state for religious minorities. It's a state in which Iranian dissidents describe to us as they most recently and bravely did in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, writing an op-ed on this issue from inside Iran. The writer, as you might imagine, was later arrested by the IRGC for writing this piece in the Wall Street Journal, saying not only are our conditions so awful, not only is this some dystopian 1984 type of life that we live, but the Western media and Western academics and Western think tanks, most of them don't cover this nearly as much as they should. So to answer your question very briefly, it's quite awful. And with that, I'll go to my prepared remarks, which I apologize in advance if they are slightly retrospective or slightly historic in nature. But my thought today was, I know that you all have been doing so much important work on Iran and hosting so many great guests for your members and affiliates, and I'm sure many of the folks kind of joined today have heard a lot about Iran. And so my goal today with my remarks was to sort of tackle it or look at the issue from a different angle and provide folks who are joining us today with perhaps some historical context and a different way that maybe they haven't looked at the issue, because the Iran conversation is so, I should say, basically run by the regime and its affiliates here in the West. So I'll try and keep my comments brief, but looking very much forward to answering everyone's questions. Of course, we're all here today because the Biden administration has spent more than 1 year attempting to get back into the JCPOA, as they describe it, what I would describe as signing a new worse deal with the Islamic dictatorship in Iran. But what I'd like to speak just briefly about is where we've come from and how we've gotten to this point. In my view, broadly, there are two fallacies that undergird the current policy of the Biden administration towards the Islamic Republic. The first is that this is all America's fault, and the second, that this regime can be reformed or dealt with. And I want to tackle the first one first. And forgive me for taking a bit of a step back into history, but I think it's important to set the foundation for where we are. Now, in the early 20th century, Iran experienced what most historians would identify as its first revolution of the 20th century, but what I would call, for reasons I'll get into shortly, its only revolution of that century, the constitutional movement and the Iranian or Persian constitutional revolution. Now, this was a nationalist movement to democratize the then monarchy of the Qajar dynasty and revitalize the country. So in that period, Iran established a parliament and a constitution modeled, interestingly, after the French and Belgian versions, so showing already the sort of progressive Western-looking vision of the revolutionaries and the constitutionalists of that time. And they wanted to make some changes to the, as you know, 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran, to have the monarch reign as opposed to rule, and to unify the country. So thereafter, you see the rise of the historical figure you're probably acquainted with, Reza Shah, who was the founder and first king of the Pahlavi dynasty, who rose to power and quickly modernized the country. The Qajars had left the country basically in a state of total disarray. It wasn't really even a country. You had ruling warlords and chieftains ruling different parts of the country. with no national unity and really no infrastructure. So he actually built Iran's first roads, railroads, universities, a modern army, and much more that we would consider the foundations of a modern state today. And for that, by Iranians, he's regarded sort of as the father of modern Iran. And fast forward to World War II, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, by the British and the Russians, who became colloquially and eternally, for all of us, really known as the Shah. So when you hear about the Shah, this is who we're referring to, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the second king of the Pahlavi dynasty. Now, despite Reza Shah's pretty remarkable progress in building the country, including its infrastructures, institutions, the country and the government were still largely reliant on Western support. The Shah, however, envisioned taking his father's modernization and building Iran into more of a self-sufficient nation, not one that was at odds with the West or that was at odds with anyone, but that was self-reliant, as any country really aims to be, but aligned certainly with the Western bloc. He envisioned building Iran into a self-reliant nation that was an economic, cultural, military, and political power, what he viewed as being in line with Iran's ancient civilization. As you know, the civilization goes back thousands of years to King Cyrus, the first establisher, really, of human rights, and that was the Shah's vision. He called this the great civilization vision for his country. And one of those was negotiating better terms with the British for Iran's oil, and eventually leading to Iranians controlling their own oil supply. As was the norm at the time, this is now the 1950s, he appointed a gentleman by the name of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. Now, initially, their relations were pretty fruitful and things were going well. Mr. Mossadegh, however, began to take some steps that caused a lot of the problems that we continue to face today. So he, sort of in an act of political demagoguery, if you will, to sort of rile up a restive population, nationalized Iran's oil from the British. And this caused an economic devastation because there were not enough Iranian engineers to produce the oil, to sell the oil. That, in addition to a British-led oil embargo, really crippled Iran's economy. So in response to the pressure that he was facing, Dr. Mossadegh, the prime minister, took a few steps that you really don't hear about. He shut down newspapers and suspended free speech. He shut down the court system, including the Supreme Court, and he dissolved the parliament. And he also began to move closer and closer to the Soviet-backed communist forces of the Iranian Communist Party and called for limitations or even revoking of the monarch's power. So when the prime minister was making moves that the Shah considered unwise or absurd, he was unwilling to do anything. But as Mossadegh moved to, for example, dissolve the parliament, dissolve the court system, acts that were deemed unconstitutional, the Shah had him dismissed. The prime minister, of course, refused and attempted instead to arrest the Shah's general. In the end, however, Iranians sort of took to the streets in favor of the Shah, and the Shah returned triumphantly from a very brief exile with his wife and returned to massive street demonstrations in his favor and against basically the economic devastation caused by Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, certainly the removal of a communist-aligned prime minister who had destroyed relations with the West was welcomed by British and Americans. Now, overall, this is probably pretty far removed from what many of you listening today have heard about this so-called coup of 1953 and about Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. You often hear it going something like this: the American coup against Iran's democratically elected prime minister, say. But as you can see by the facts that I've mentioned, the two main components of that statement are totally farcical. First of all, Mr. Mossadegh was not democratically elected. In fact, at that time, as was typical for constitutionalist monarchical systems, the prime minister was appointed by the Shah. So he was not, in fact, democratically elected by the Iranian people. So that part of overthrowing a democratically elected prime minister was simply false. And second of all, this was not an American engineered coup, although America certainly welcomed it. I imagine I wasn't alive at the time. I wasn't back there with Kermit Roosevelt and the CIA, but they certainly supported it in some way, and they certainly welcomed it. Now, I don't just mention this to hash out historical disagreements or judge historical actors, but really to set the stage for today's, what I view as policy follies. Now, this myth of the 1953 coup has permeated in the West, especially in left-leaning circles and in Washington and in the media. Now, while Dr. Mossadegh is almost entirely irrelevant in Iran today, you don't find Iranians talking much about him besides, sort of forces, left-leaning communist groups. They may idolize him, but really amongst average Iranians, he's almost irrelevant. Despite that, you cannot find an Iran-related news article, a documentary, an academic course, a TV show segment in the United States or the West that does not bring up this so-called coup as the reason for all of our problems in the US-Iran relationship, and presenting all of this, to my first point, as the big myth of this is all America's fault. Now, this is based, in my view, and I think the facts bear this out, honestly, in an intense and inherent anti-Americanism that is really clear in the elite circles, particularly in the media, unfortunately. Now, this conventional wisdom has, for decades, been that this transition that our government, the American government, purportedly committed against the Iranians 70 years ago has never been forgotten and is the real roadblock to good relations. Now, in my analysis, as an Iranian American especially, not only is this false, but it's really an inherently Orientalist and even a racist view of things to say that Iranians are these irrational, angry people who can't get over a fake coup from 70 years ago. Now, if Iranians are angry with America, aside from the respect and the love that they have for this country and its values, it's because they think that the United States, as it's showing right now, seems to continue to insist on siding with the Islamic Republic instead of with them. So that's myth number one, that this is all the United States' fault. And I'll get to myth number two and then look forward to answering everyone's questions. Now, where America actually did play somewhat of a role, unlike in 1953, which is claimed, was in the downfall of the Shah, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks, Sarah, when Jimmy Carter, president at the time, effectively revoked America's longstanding support for this progressive, Western-oriented monarchy that was not only building Iran into really out of a backwater into a modern nation state, but also into a solid ally for the United States, for the West, one who guaranteed security in the region, one who established productive relations with Arab neighbors in the region across the Persian Gulf, with the state of Israel. I think that you see once the Shah was removed from the equation in the Middle East, everything started to go effectively to hell in a handbasket. Almost immediately, you see the Soviets invade Afghanistan because they realize the Shah is no longer maintaining security in the region. You see Iraq invade Iran. You see thereafter Iraq invade Kuwait. You see this massive funding of terrorism across the region. So the Shah was effectively the linchpin that held together, or I should say a secular democratic Iran was the linchpin that held together security in the Middle East, and it all fell apart. So we get back to your introductory remarks, Sarah, of 1979 and Khomeini's movement culminating in the Shah leaving Iran. And this is commonly referred to, of course, as the Islamic Revolution. And almost immediately, again, we see the ugly head of anti-Americanism here in the West, in the United States, rearing its head when you have at the time Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the United Nations calling Ayatollah Khomeini a saint. In an interview with the New York Times. So that sort of sets the tone for this new dialogue towards the regime for 43 years, and especially in one political party, unfortunately, but more broadly across the media and academia. And this leads us to myth number two, that this regime can be reformed or that it can be dealt with. And debunking this myth, in my view, requires asking it and finding out what this regime really is. Now, personally, I view what happened in 1979 not necessarily as a revolution, but more of an anti-revolution. This is the anti-revolution, anti-constitutionalist revolution that I just referred to, when Iranians had for decades been striving to modernize their country, to bring about democratic institutions like a ruling constitution, like a parliament that represented their interests. And this was more a reactionary turn against that and towards a system that I'll describe in short here. Now, this revolution was not, as historic revisionists would have you believe, hijacked by the clerics, though it did fool many people with calls for equality and freedom and independence, but it wasn't hijacked. The revolution was led very astutely, very cleverly by Khomeini and folks like their allies in the West, like the UN ambassador for Mr. Carter, who I mentioned, who called him a saint. Many called him the second Gandhi, who was going to bring about peace in the region and who was going to be an ally for us potentially. So this revolution was led by Khomeini and his leftist allies, including the MEK, to establish what they viewed as an Islamo-Marxist utopia on earth, what the Shah called the union of the reactionary left and the reactionary black. So you have this union of forces of radical Islamists and radical Marxists, and they come together to lead this movement and fundamentally create this regime, which is not a nation state per se, but more a revolutionary cause. Up until this day, 43 years after their revolution, they still have revolutionary courts, a revolutionary guard. Everything for them is about the revolution, not the nation state. And this is critical because it's not dedicated to Iran or to Iranians, but instead to the cause of the Islamic Revolution and its ideology. But it's important to ask, what is that ideology? And you already know that it's fundamentally anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Jewish. Iranians also believe that it's fundamentally anti-Iranian. It is at odds with their century-long, millennia-long history. In fact, one of the first, we just celebrated the Iranian New Year of Nowruz. Sarah was kind enough to wish me a happy Nowruz, for which I was most thankful. This is a 2,000-year-old tradition of celebrating spring and rebirth. It's a totally secular holiday, not part of any religious faith. One of the first things that the Khomeini revolutionaries tried to do in coming to power was to get rid of such traditions, to get rid of Iranians' millennia-long history. Because for them, in fact, Khomeini said this upon returning to Iran. He said that patriotism, that love of one's country, love of Iran by the Iranian people, was just another form of devil worshiping. It was just Satanism by another way. The only path was the path of his view of Islam. So this is critical to understand. And this regime, you've probably heard the term the velayat al-faqih, or in the original, the guardianship of the jurist, rules on behalf, in their view, of God until the return of the hidden imam, who is to come with Jesus Christ and bring about the end of times. So this is their sort of messianic view of things. And the guardian, the velayat, the faqih, pardon me, is first Khomeini and now Khamenei. So effectively, they view the population as, and anyone, as a class that needs protecting and guiding and controlling, as previous laws would have viewed, for example, children or the mentally disabled. That's effectively how they view the population, unable to make decisions for themselves, untrustworthy to make decisions for themselves, and therefore they need this guardianship, this velayat, to control every aspect of people's lives. And so first Khomeini, now Khamenei, in their view, are God's temporary magistrates on earth, effectively responsible for doling out and expanding this view of divine justice in the meantime, until the hidden imam is to return. Now, how have they done this? So among the first things they did, aside from sort of fighting, as I mentioned, with Iranian ancient culture, the first target, as you probably know, was Iranian women. They immediately repealed many of the Shah's progressive laws. For example, and this is really quite disturbing to discuss, so I apologize, but they lowered, for example, the age of marriage for girls to 9 years old. The Shah had raised it to 15 or 18, in line with most other countries. They lowered it to 9 years old. And this is not, a 9-year-old marrying a 10-year-old, which would be sickening in the first place. This is a 9-year-old marrying a 60-year-old man. And these are the sort of laws that they immediately begin to implement. Women were denied the right to divorce, to custody, to inheritance, and often today, of course, we talk about gender discrimination and inequality. This is not just some, for example, permeating social inequality that existed. This was putting on the books of the laws of the land that women are legally worth half of men. That's the law. It's still law today that women are legally worth half of men in all aspects. So if Sarah and I were to go to court, I win 100% of the time because my testimony is worth twice as much as hers. She would have to bring another woman for our testimonies even to be equal. And of course, as you may imagine, they're often discounted. So women are legally worth half of men in Iran. They also began to punish, torture, and kill members of the LGBTQ community who are either executed for their crimes, as they would describe them, or they're forced to have gender reassignment surgery. So, for example, a gay couple, one of the members of that couple is forced effectively by the government to become a woman through gender reassignment surgery. And I'm going to speak briefly in a second about the regime's soft power in the West. But the regime's lobbyists and supporters in the West have, for example, talked about this issue, and they've twisted it on its head to say, look how progressive the Islamic Republic is. They are offering free gender reassignment surgery. I mean, this is really quite disturbing. I mean, this is, Mengele-style state-forced operations on people to change their bodies. And that's what this regime is doing. People of, quote, non-acceptable faiths, for example, the Baha'is, were considered subhuman and still are today. And they were subject to effective ethnic cleansing, just like the Jewish community. 90% of Iran's Jewish community was effectively forced to leave the country, which is the definition of ethnic cleansing in terms of the population transfer. And additionally, tens of thousands of those who rejected this political ideology were tortured, were jailed in Khomeini and now Khamenei's prisons. And they have used, again, I apologize, some of the most abhorrent forms of torture. Young children and wives were raped in front of those who were detained in the hopes of extracting false confessions. Whippings, beatings, lashes, electroshock, sinking the heads of prisoners, again, I apologize, into buckets of feces. These were all very common and remain even common forms of torture in the Islamic Republic's prisons. Their brutality, of course, is not limited to Iran's borders because they do not believe that their divine right to rule is limited to Iran's geography, but really to the whole world. And therefore, they've assassinated hundreds of opponents of their regime abroad in the past 43 years. All of this added together basically is a 43-year track record of crimes against humanity on a mass scale. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues at Mufti here themselves have spent time in the Islamic Republic's prisons. Some of my very good friends have been tortured. Their bodies, still bear the lashes and the whippings of the torturers of Khamenei in their secret prisons. And this was exhibited, unfortunately, most recently in the November 2019 protest. If I could ask Naomi just to show the first image briefly, just to give you, nothing graphic, but just to give everyone something short. The most recent thing that we saw in this regard was in November 2019. You probably remember these protests. They were set off by a hike in gas prices, and they quickly, as most protests in Iran do, turned very political against the regime, calling for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. Numbers say 1,500 were killed. Some other analysis that we've seen say perhaps up to 6,000. The regime simply shut off the internet, mounted heavy machine guns on their trucks, and mowed people down. Among those killed, were dozens of children. Ami Reza was 13, Nikta was 14, Muhammad was 15, Ali was 12, Ali Reza was 17. I mean, these are young children who were just killed. They had, their heads blown off, their hearts were shot with live ammunition. So this is the regime. Thank you, Naomi, very much. This is the regime that we're talking about. And much of this was done by the IRGC, that some people, including most shamefully in my view, high-ranking US government officials are saying should be removed from the State Department's foreign terrorist list because apparently it's just symbolic. But if Mr. Malley were sitting here, and our group has requested to meet with him multiple times on behalf of the Iranian American community, and he's repeatedly refused to meet with us, what I would tell him is that I assure you, Mr. Malley, that the scars that my friends bear on their bodies, the bullets that exploded the heads of these children whose images you just saw, the Syrian children who were gassed, these are not symbolic. These are real people. They're real children who were murdered. And so that's why for so many of us, it is unimaginable that the US government would remove this group, the IRGC, that in many cases committed these acts from the US foreign terrorist list. Now, if blowing off the heads of little children is not an act of terrorism, frankly, I don't know what is. And Sarah, you mentioned in your introductory remarks, many of the people who the administration is proposing to remove from the terrorist list, and they are arch criminals. They are not people with whom we disagree on things. The listing of the IRGC and so many of the regime's entities by the Trump administration was not just something that was a political tactic. In my view, it was a moral judgment that they were absolutely right on. and it's a moral decision, the Biden administration is preparing to make that they're absolutely wrong on. And I'll wrap up shortly, but sadly, none of the things I've described, ladies and gentlemen, none of this has really ever, to the extent that it deserves, been roundly condemned by the media. This level of brutality, especially against women, is often, I hear, just defined as culture. This is the culture. This is how they are. And this is, again, if you think about it, a really Orientalist and a very racist way of viewing Iranians, to say this is how they act, this is how they think. No, Iran has a culture of 2,500 years. The founders really of human rights. Much of our founding documents here in the United States, our Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers were looking to the writings, for example, of Cyrus the Great for inspiration. So many of the commentary we see is just saying this is just culture. But it's not Iranian culture because, as I said, this is not an Iranian regime. And for this reason, many Iranians are so sensitive about wording. For example, they say Iran did not commit this crime, the Islamic Republic did, and that's true. And one more note, they're very sensitive and they insist on saying this almost to show the world where they stand, that they say, no, this is not the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's the Islamic Republic in Iran, because there's nothing about this regime that is of Iran. There's nothing about this regime that's Iranian. In fact, it's anti-Iranian. You'll notice the IRGC that we talked about that you mentioned, Sarah, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It does not have the word Iran in the name. It doesn't have the word because Iran is not important for them. It's their revolutionary cause that's important for them. So to cover all of these actions up, the regime has operated and supported a very successful soft power operation here in Washington and European capitals. And many of you have probably heard about these groups. And it has employed an extremely successful charm offensive, especially with left-leaning or media circles, to whitewash its crimes. And it has wrapped itself in this sort of anti-imperialist banner, which has endeared it so much to crowds and facilitated the widespread acceptance of the second great myth, which I'm wrapping up, which is that this regime that I've just described, in all of its horror and all of its terror, can be reformed and can be dealt with and wants to deal with us. But such revolutionary ideologues are certainly, I think we can all agree, not reformable. But this myth is guided by the notion that, especially on the left, enough concessions can be offered to get the regime to act in Iran's best interest. And if I'm being fair, sometimes on the right, that if we just enact enough pressure, we can get them to act in their own interest. But both of these are based on the fundamental flaw and missing the point that this regime will never act in Iran's national interest because it is fundamentally at odds with Iran's best interest. Now, these two myths, and I apologize for going on, have guided, or I would say misguided, US-Iran policy more or less for the past 4 decades, with, of course, a noted exception of maximum pressure, which we think was great, but we would say was necessary but not sufficient. And hopefully at a future event, we have the opportunity to talk about that. These 4 decades of policy have got us here. And in my view, the only blame that can be placed on our country, on the United States, on American policy, is that for too long, it has tried the same thing and expected a different result. And just to be clear about what those results are, and folks on this call are probably much more better acquainted than I am, but murdering countless American soldiers and civilians, taking dozens of Americans hostage. Some Americans are sitting hostage in Tehran right now, being the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, attempting assassinations on US soil, including against high-ranking US government officials, interference in our elections, and much, much more. And none of this will change. None of this will change as long as this regime is in power. Now, in closing, I'd just like to propose briefly a third path, which we believe, and the majority of Iranians, given the chance, would call for. And I'm going to ask Naomi just to play a brief video, which came from the Iran policy conference that we had February 10th, just to hear a bit a voice from Iran.
به اطلاع شما میرسانم که اغلب رسانه‌ها، اندیشکده‌ها و مراکز سیاستگذاری شما در حوزه ایران در راستای یکی از بزرگترین پروژه‌های امنیتی جمهوری اسلامی توسط نیروهای نفوذی آنها تسخیر شده است و شما متوجه نیستید که محتوای مورد نیاز برای سیاستگذاری را خود جمهوری اسلامی است که دارد تأمین می‌کند. آنها با این نفوذ در حال تولید محتوای غیرواقعی و دستکاری در حقیقت هستند. آنها در تلاشند روایت ترسناکی از تغییر سیاسی در ایران به شما القا کنند. مثلا بگویند در نبود جمهوری اسلامی کشور ایران شبیه عراق یا سوریه دچار جنگ قومی یا مذهبی می شود. به شما اطمینان می دهیم که هر رسانی یا اندیشکده‌ای چنین چیزی را القا می کند، مستقیم یا غیر مستقیم در خدمت پروژه امنیتی جمهوری اسلامی است. آنها تمام حقوق، آزادی و امنیت را گروگان می گیرند تا بتوانند باقی بمانند. حال از شما می پرسم، آنچه ایرانیان به قیمت آوارگی، زندان و مرگ روایت می کنند حقیقت قابل استناد است یا آنچه دستگاه پروپاگاندای جمهوری اسلامی از طریق رسانه‌ها و اندیشکده‌های تسخیر شده به خورد سیاستمداران می‌دهد؟ چه کسی به شما القا کرده است که اگر جمهوری اسلامی برود ما ایرانیان اصول دیپلماتیک تأمین منافع دو طرفه را بلد نیستیم؟ کمترین منافع تغییر نظام سیاسی در ایران، فروکش کردن بنیادگرایی و کاهش ناامنی در منطقه و جهان است. آنچه در ایران دیدم این است که جامعه آماده رزمی پایان دهنده با حکومت است و تغییر سیاسی در ایران قطعی خواهد بود. جامعه ایران نیروی انسانی مورد نیاز این تغییر را در دل خود پرورش داده است. نیروی انسانی که هم آمادگی تغییر سیاسی را دارد و هم توان اداره ایران را. این افراد همان طرد شدگان 43 سال گذشته هستند که با چنگ و دندان برای بقای و ارتقاء خویش کوشیدند. این سرمایه انسانی را شما هرگز در محاسبات خود نیاورده اید. ما نه سرباز شما را می‌خواهیم و نه پول شما را. ما تنها سیاست شما را می‌خواهیم. سیاستی که تا به امروز تلاش غیر عقلانی سیاستمداران غربی برای جا دادن جمهوری اسلامی در نظم جهانی بوده است. شما باید خیزش‌های مردمی ایران را بپذیرید و آنها را به رسمیت بشناسید. شما از همراهی جمهوری اسلامی دست بکشید، آنها میان مردم باختند. جامعه ایران جامعه‌ای سکولار شده و در ارزش‌های انسانی چون آزادی، برابری، امنیت و عدالت با غرب مشترک بوده و به دنبال پیوند با جهانی است که به این ارزش‌ها پایبند است. حال انتخاب با جامعه جهانی است که خیزش‌های یک جامعه سکولار را همراهی کند یا حکومتی بنیادگرا و واپسگرا را. هموطنان من در ایران با شما و یا بدون شما از تلاش برای تغییر سیاسی دست بر نخواهند داشت. برای رسیدن به حکومتی نرمال می‌کوشیم و به جمهوری اسلامی پایان خواهیم داد. پاینده صلح و آزادی، پاینده ایران.
Thank you, Naomi. So this was, as you saw, Mehdi Hajed. He was a high-ranking political official in Shiraz, one of Iran's largest cities. He was removed from his post and jailed for standing up for the rights of the Baha'i community, who I mentioned earlier, who were continue to face apartheid circumstances in Iran. So this is what I believe the vast majority of the Iranian people want. That's what we here at Nufti, as an Iranian American organization, are working every day to engage the nearly 1 million strong Iranian American community to support across the country. I'm sure many of you have many Iranian American friends, perhaps here in Washington or Los Angeles, New York, across the country. And what we would call for is quite simple in relation to what's happening right now. For the US negotiating team to leave the Vienna negotiations immediately, to hold the regime accountable for its crimes, to only in the first place accept negotiations with this regime if and only if they were to cover all of the important areas. The Obama administration started this mistake, and the Biden administration is continuing the same mistake by boxing these issues and only discussing one at a time. Their continuous point has been, we will discuss nuclear and then we'll get to the others, while Iranian officials have said, we will never ever discuss our support of terrorism, we will never ever discuss human rights, we will never ever discuss regional issues. So you should only accept negotiations when everything is on the table. That's the only time. And finally, to begin the policy of maximum support of the Iranian people, which I'd be happy to discuss further another time or in the questions. But the negotiations are really the supplications that we see going on in Vienna right now are a shameful slap in the face to the people of Iran who have repeatedly risen up for their freedom, and is a fundamental, in my view, abdication of not only American values, but ignorance of our security needs. And the only way going forward to ensure dignity for the Iranian people and security for our country and our interests is when we actually stand with the Iranian people and put aside these two great myths that for too long have guided our policy. So I sincerely apologize for going over what I thought I would take, but thank you again for having me, and I look most forward to answering any questions that there may be.
Cameron, please, there is absolutely no need to apologize. This was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and so informative. And I just hope that we could, share this video to scores and to thousands of people, because it's really essential that people understand. As the wonderful Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov had once said, if you really want to know a nation's foreign policy, you have to look at how they treat their internal dissident population. So we, unfortunately, are in a position right now where we're seeing our American negotiators groveling and empowering the Islamic Republic. And it is appalling, absolutely appalling that the United States, which is really one of the strongest nations in the world, do not know how to negotiate. We're anything just to get a deal. And I did want to ask you one question before I turn it over to my wonderful colleague Hussein Abubakar Mansour, and that is it okay if you speak a little bit about NIAC, Trita Parsi, and maybe Ali Vaez, and because many people feel that they represent the Iranian people?
Well, they certainly don't. So this is, in my remarks, I mentioned briefly this soft power operation that the regime has very effectively, whether directly managed or supported, or in some ways facilitated, or has been connected to here in the United States. So that group in particular has been one of the main focuses of ire of not only the Iranian American community, because for so long they claimed to represent our interests, but even of the people of Iran, who understand that the policies that that group and those individuals are advocating are really in complete contradiction to what the people of Iran want. I mean, in complete contradiction to what the Iranian American community wants. They've been incredibly effective, as I said, in using a few broad points of rhetoric. One is, we don't want war. Look, we don't want war either. Nobody wants war. This is such an obvious thing. Or, we want peace. Everyone loves peace. We want peace too. But our view is that not that basically putting pressure on this regime or supporting the Iranian people will cause war. It is the continuation of this regime in power that will eventually cause war, unfortunately. Because of the terrorism that they support around the world, because of their actions against the United States, the Iranian people, they will eventually, unfortunately, in my view, lead us to a war if Iran is not transitioned to a secular democracy. So that will cause war. So they've been incredibly effective at using rhetoric, at using some broad paint strokes that a lot of people can get behind. No war, no sanctions. Nobody likes war. Nobody likes sanctions. Sanctioning is not something that you do for fun. It is a policy tool that you use for a particular outcome. So they've been incredibly effective. For a long time, they had fooled many members of the Iranian American community into thinking that they were, just a group that was, pro-peace and pro-Iranian culture. But there was a lawsuit against that particular group in which many documents came out, including their communications with high-ranking Islamic Republic officials. And so it's incredibly disturbing to us. In fact, in the previous administration, there was an attempt by some senators to launch a FARA investigation, claiming that they were, in effect, a lobbying operation for the Islamic Republic. And I don't know whether that has reached any conclusion. But aside from the actual legal implications of this, I'm not an attorney, so I won't speak to that. But they've effectively put, someone said it, their goal has been to put lipstick on a pig. And I think what many of us have found out is, you put lipstick on a pig and it's still a pig. and it's a pretty ugly pig. And so their long-term goal, effectively, it seems to me, whether that group or those individuals mentioned, or broadly this network of the regime's soft power campaign abroad, has been to present themselves as the voice of reason, the voice of diplomacy, the voice of engagement, as they would say. But effectively, what they are doing is they are voicing the same talking points of a brutal, murderous, anti-Semitic, anti-women, anti-religious minority regime. And there's no other way to couch it, though they've tried. The good thing is now the Iranian American community has realized this. Even people in Iran have realized this. You know, we have these dissident rappers in Iran who sing rap songs, and they mention that group and they mention those people. So Iranians are very, very well aware of this really a poisonous attempt by these groups to change public opinion. And I'm glad to say that I think that their time has come to an end in terms of being an influence here in town.
Excellent. All right, and now it's my pleasure to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour. Hussein.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Cameron, for such an excellent and timely presentation about the conditions of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. For our audiences who've been asking if this recording will be available, of course, yes, this recording will be available after the webinar is over. It's going to be emailed to you on your email, and it's going to be available on our website. And all our previous webinars, you can find them on our website, imetonline.org. We've received a lot of questions. It's now very obvious I'm not going to be able to go through all of these questions. I'm going to actually make it worse, and I'm going to take a personal prerogative. I'm going to ask you a question before I move to the audience's questions, so I hope the audiences forgive me. Cameron, last week I had a conversation actually with the deputy director of the Iranian affairs desk in the State Department. And she basically gave me her view, and seems to be the view of a lot of officials in the State Department, and that's the view of Envoy Mali. She speaks to Mali regularly, that basically the future of Middle East stability and the future of U.S. interests in the Middle East is actually in the hands of Iran. We have to have a good relationship with Iran, because Iran now holds all the cards. They hold the cards in Lebanon. They hold the cards, a lot of cards they hold in Syria. They hold the cards in Iraq. They hold the cards in Yemen. That's just a matter of fact. And as a matter of realist American foreign policy, we need to just play ball with Iran. They are, they have a lot of power, and just need to recognize that power and work with it. Yes, they have a terrible human rights record, but we've been friends with the Saudis and the Egyptians for decades, and they also not any better. So what would you say to that personally, that the future of America in the Middle East is actually on the side of Iran, not on the side of our traditional alliances?
Sure, I'm very glad you asked the question, Hussein, because it's something that a lot of people mention. It's something a lot of people bring up. I would say two things broadly. I think there is a world in which we could, the United States and the West broadly, could have very productive relationships with Iran, where they could effectively rely on Iran as some sort of anchor for peace, some stabilizing force, sort of the third leg of the stool, if you will, in the Middle East. That will never happen under the Islamic Republic, because it's not a reliable partner. This is something that was beginning to take shape, and in fact was quite effective for some time, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, under the previous regime, under the Shah, before the Islamic Republic. Effectively, you had the United States relying on the Iranian government at that time to a great extent, ensure security in the region, ensure stability in the region. And that was because the United States was able to take confidence in the fact that we had a reliable partner on the other side of the telephone. You didn't have a revolutionary regime whose raison d'etre was America's elimination, whose raison d'etre was the Jewish state's elimination. How can you, my response to a person like that who says that is, how can you have a reliable partner who is dedicated to your destruction? And I think that the reason they're able to make that argument is because they're still being guided by, if not one, but both of the myths, the great myths I laid out in my remarks, particularly the second one, that we can deal with this regime, that look, they'll get it. It's in their best interest to do this. They don't care about Iran's best interest. You know, there was a cleric in Iran speaking recently, talking about the sanctions. And he said, the people of Iran need to take inspiration from the people of Yemen, because they are surviving by eating grass, and we, the Iranian people, will survive by eating grass. If they sanction us to kingdom come, we'll spend every last dollar on our brothers in Hezbollah and our brothers in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and the Iranian people will eat grass, and we'll be proud of that. That's not a partner. That is a maniacal, suicidal person on the other end of the telephone that you're calling. So it's not a reliable partner. You can maybe say that, and it can, potentially could be a house of cards that holds for 6 months, for a year. That will eventually collapse because you don't have a reliable partner. And the second thing I would say is, you mentioned, Lebanon, Iraq, the places that the regime has established strongholds. Even those strongholds, much like the regime itself, are not necessarily in place forever. We saw last year these massive, widespread protests by the people of Lebanon, the streets of Beirut and other cities, where they were chanting against the Islamic Republic. They're chanting death to the Islamic Republic, the very same chants that we see on the streets of Tehran and on the streets across Iran. We see in Iraq, we see even in the holy Shia city of Karbala, them burning and sacking the Islamic Republic's consulate there, and burning the emblem of the Islamic Republic. So it's not really, basically, in my view, sound policy or good strategy to rely on this sort of permanent occupation of the Islamic Republic of these countries, because the people, in my view, eventually will not tolerate it, as we've already seen the limitations, basically, of their tolerance for this. The very last point is, irrespective of my personal view or the view of Iranians or Iranian Americans, that for moral reasons, for security reasons for the United States, that this regime should go. Irrespective of that, in my view, it's sound US policy to take into account the possibility, again, whether or not normatively it should happen, but the possibility that this regime could collapse. Because as we have seen with other totalitarian states, whether it's the USSR, whether it's the countries behind the Iron Curtain, whether it's other totalitarian regimes around the world, eventually they collapse. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, check your watches because in 6 months these guys are out of here. I don't know. I still don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. But what history does tell us is that these regimes do not collapse. So to base our broad strategy in the Middle East on a regime that could collapse is simply not a very good strategy, I would say.
Can I just add one thing? With the $90 billion that Gabe Naranha has said will be released in frozen assets, it's going to cement the power of the regime. And I mean, this is not a way to work in America's best long-term strategic interests. It
will certainly be going. Yeah, it will certainly be going to, as you said in your introduction, it will certainly be going to the regime's leadership, to its proxies. There's this famous video, of course, you've probably seen, by Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, saying, my dear friends, as long as the Islamic Republic has money, we have money. Don't worry, we have some hard times, but the cavalry's coming. So this is very clear. This is not my opinion that this money will be spent here. It's very obvious where this money will be spent. So of course, that's one of the most worrying factors for many of us who work on this issue, and of course for the Iranian people, that this would solidify the regime. One thing I would take off my advocacy hat and put on my analysis hat for a second, and I would just caution people that you never know what can happen in a country like Iran, because interestingly, these wave of protests that we've seen in the past 3 to 4 years in Iran, which have been the most serious political protests in terms of the weight, the heft of the slogans people are chanting, they're no longer calling for reforms. They're very clearly calling for the end of this regime. That's very obvious by the slogans they're chanting. The first of those protests, the day protests in 2016, those, interestingly enough, occurred before President Trump made the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. And in my analysis, the reason for that was because you saw this influx of cash to Iran, and by that I mean to the Iranian regime. And people had seen all this media hype saying, wow, Iran is going to become, like Turkey. Iran is going to become like, Switzerland in 6 months. And of course, when you have those expectations raised so high, and the Iranian people saw very quickly that money, as you said, Sarah, was not going to their pocket. It wasn't making, eggs at the supermarket cheaper. It wasn't, helping them in any way. It was going to the corrupt clerics, and it was going to the corrupt clerics' friends who were terrorists across the region. And so we saw very quickly this protest movement, even when the United States was still part of the JCPOA. So again, just as a point of analysis, that would be an interesting point I would suggest people watch, is even if this deal is signed, again, some shorter, worse deal, as I would call it, is signed, that possibility is still there. It would, of course, be awful because these really evil people would be enriched, but not necessarily by any means at the end of the line, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cameron. Are you presenting this information to the U.S. public, the government? Have you written a book? How can we get this out more widely?
Well, so Mufti's work is sort of multi-pronged. So again, as Sarah was kind of mentioned, we're based here in Washington, D.C. A lot of the work that we do is with the media. So not only providing them our own analysis and commentary on events that are happening, but actually connecting Iranian dissidents, even in whether those in exile or inside the country, to media outlets. So trying to help get their pieces published, trying to help get them interview slots. So we sort of play a facilitating role with the media. We also do this broadly for the policy and media community. One example was this Iran conference that you just saw a short video from that we had on February 10th, where we had over 35 speakers from some of, across the political spectrum in terms of the think tanks. You had on the same stage somebody from the Center for American Progress and FDD. So we really try to be as open as possible in terms of our open door and Big Tent policy. But we're also a young organization, so we really are trying to grow our efforts. But we do things in the policy space. For example, this large conference which we held. Going forward, we hope to hold many more events. Certainly expand our presence on Capitol Hill. We're lucky to have a good relationship with some folks on the Hill. I know that Hossein, you and Sarah are well acquainted with the Hill. You all are doing so much good work there. So we hope to expand our efforts there as well. But I would certainly invite those who are interested to get our updates from our website or from future events. It will be a pleasure to host them at our next in-person event. This conference, the Iran conference, will be an annual conference going forward. And of course, we also have some other events throughout the year. So we have some basically multi-pronged strategy of getting the message out. I've not written a book, but I'm not sure anyone would want to read my book, but we'll see.
I'm sure at least in this audience, you'll have a lot of people who want to read your book.
Right. Okay. While we're on the subject, I really would like to encourage everybody to try to support to the best of your ability Mufti. Please go to their website at www.nuftiiran.org. It's an amazing organization, and we really, want to see them grow from strength to strength. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt. Okay.
About the conference, we did receive a question about the conference. Was the conference attended by U.S. government officials and elected officials?
Yes, it was attended by both. So we had speakers. We had several high-ranking speakers from the former administration. I had the pleasure of moderating a fireside chat with Brian Hook, who is, folks probably know, was the former U.S. Special Envoy for Iran. He later went on to play a critical role in the Abraham Accords. We also had a fireside chat with the other U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Elliot Abrams, who folks also probably know from his long service in foreign policy. We had a third former presidential envoy, Joel Rayburn. He was one of President Trump's special envoys for Syria and for the Levant. We also had Morgan Ortagus as a speaker there, who was a former State Department spokesperson, current candidate for Congress, of course, in Tennessee. And we also had Congressman Mike Waltz there speaking, who was a congressman from Florida's 5th District, I believe. Great gentleman and great friend. In the audience, we also had many former members of the National Security Council, the State Department, foreign embassies were represented there. Of course, we had a long time invitation out to Mr. Malley to come speak in a fireside chat. He did not want to join us, which was unfortunate. But no current serving administration officials attended, unfortunately. But we would have loved the opportunity to certainly have an interesting debate, conversation with them. And had they come, we certainly agreed on most everything. But that was our whole goal, was to have a constructive dialogue and a respectful place for them to come where wouldn't be attacks on them, but would be, I think, the rightful critiques that they need to hear. But seems that they weren't so open to dialogue, unfortunately, despite them always talking about dialogue and engagement.
Yeah, it's actually it blows my mind that the administration that made human rights the guiding principle, its foreign policy, not to send any official to attend the largest conference about human rights in Iran in DC.
Yeah.
I'll make this the last question because we ran out of time, so I apologize to our audience again. All the time in the news we hear, the entire world hears about Israel and human rights violations and investigations by the UN, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court. You seem to portray a picture of an Iran that has a serious human rights issue, yet we don't really hear about investigations in those amazing international institutions or uproar about what's going on here. Why has there been any systematic investigation of the IRGC human rights violations in any of those bodies?
Unfortunately, no. I have several friends and colleagues who are really working quite tirelessly on this. For example, Sarah mentioned in introductory remarks that the current president who was selected for this post last year, Ebrahim Raisi, is a serious human rights abuser who has, as she mentioned, led these kangaroo courts which executed or really murdered thousands of political dissidents. So there are some movements by some people to bring him to justice, but on a systematic level in these international institutions that you mentioned, Hussein, there really hasn't been a concerted effort, and certainly nothing of a concerted effort on the scale of what we see against the state of Israel. And this to me is not only shameful, but I think it's important to think about the reasons behind it. And in my view, in my analysis, it sort of goes back to some of what I mentioned earlier in this broad theme of anti-Americanism. We see a really unfortunate, and I think you would agree, a really unfortunate trend in American politics. Again, we're a bipartisan organization. There was, for example, a great press conference today by multiple Democratic congressmen and congresswomen against some of the components of the negotiations going on in Vienna. So we support Democrats who are doing that work, and we hope there will be more. But unfortunately, you tend to see in the Democratic Party, especially the quote-unquote progressive left, this view that dictatorships that are quote-unquote anti-American or anti-imperialist, they seem to find a soft spot in the hearts of many of these people, whether it's the Islamic Republic, whether it's the Cuban communist dictatorship, whether it was Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro. They don't seem to take the crimes against humanity, or even in history, Mao or Stalin, against those people seriously. I mean, how often do you hear people talking about the millions of people that Mao murdered, or the millions that Stalin murdered? I mean, you have young kids running around, young progressives running around with T-shirts of Mao on their T-shirt, the pictures of Mao on their T-shirt, and this sort of broad, I don't know what it is, this broad view that it's okay to be a dictatorship, it's okay to murder and slaughter your people as long as you're anti-imperialist. That seems to be what's happening. It's really quite shameful. However, when you see other countries who are, don't have a perfect record, for example, in that corner of the world, the Middle East, the Arab nations, for example, who are closer to America, you see even, and I don't mean to compare what different governments do, it's not my area of expertise. One event happens and they blow it up, and you see it for months. Let's take a specific example without taking too much of your audience's time. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which I think we all agree was unacceptable. It was abhorrent to kill a journalist, or to kill anyone really, to kill any dissident. You walk we all live in DC. You walk down the streets and you see Jamal Khashoggi Street. What do I say to Iranians inside the country, dissidents, or young people who reach out to me and say, where is Navid Afkari Street? Where are the streets named after the 1,500 people who were slaughtered in the streets of Iran? How come the U.S. government isn't doing that? How come progressives don't care about us? Do our lives even matter? So these are the questions that people are forced to ask, and it's unfortunate, but you can understand why people ask these questions, because they don't see their case pleaded at the international level. Yet they see, a democracy, let's say, like Israel, taken to the highest level of these courts, and this strange obsession with a country like Israel. And I can understand some people will say, you have to hold your friends and democracies to higher standards, and I think Israel wants to be held to a higher standard. But to ignore the sickening crimes that are committed by this regime and by others is really an abdication of moral leadership, and is really, as I said, a slap in the face to the victim. So I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately, except that it seems to be an ongoing theme that we see.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I could not have said it better myself. It's been a source of huge frustration for me for many, many decades. And as my dear deceased friend, Jean Kirkpatrick, used to say, it's, blame America first, and then, of course, blame Israel. And so I cannot thank you enough for your wonderful analysis and as well as advocacy, and for everything that you do and stand for. And let's hope that your deepest, most innermost heartfelt prayers and wishes do come true, and this horrific Islamic dictatorship will be overthrown, and that we will one day have democracy and human rights in Iran. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar. We also can use all of the support that you can muster up to support, if you like what we do, to support the good work of AMET. And you can go to www.ametonline.org/invest to invest in the work of AMET, but also please be sure to invest in the National Union for Democracy in Iran as well. Thank you very, very much, and have a great day.
And if I can, at the end, I would just offer my greetings and my best wishes and prayers for the upcoming Passover. And thank you again so much, Sarah and Hussein and Naomi, for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Cameron. All the best. Bye.